Okay, the final three chapters that we're going to discuss in hospitality law are Chapter 9, Chapter 10, and Chapter 12. Um, these next chapters are based primarily in the theory of negligence. So, Chapter 9 is your responsibility as a hospitality operator in general. We discuss your duties. Um, Chapter 10 is your responsibilities to guests, which really is just expanding on Chapter 9. And then Chapter 12, we're going to discuss a little bit more detailing on your responsibilities when serving food and beverage. I chose not to discuss Chapter 11 because I feel like Chapter 11 was already, for the most part, discussed in 9 and 10. And in streamlining and efficiency and assignments, I thought it made more sense to really hit 9 and 10 because that covers everything. And then obviously Chapter 12, we'll get into food and beverage specifically because there are some nuances to that that are not necessarily discussed in chapters 9 and 10. Unlike Chapter 11 is your responsibilities in handling guest property, which if you use the lessons from 9 and 10, it already makes sense. So anyway, given that these next three chapters are based primarily in the theory of negligence, let's first discuss what negligence is. It's you're not acting reasonably prudent under certain circumstances. And there's four elements, though, that need to be proven in order to be held liable for negligence. So the first one is that a plaintiff has to show that they were actually owed a duty of care by the defendant. And the defendant in this case is going to be you as the hospitality operator. So the plaintiff's going to have to show that you owed them a duty of care, number one. Number two, they're going to have to show that you failed to provide the standard of care needed to fulfill that duty of care, which is known as a breach of the duty of care. Third, that breach of the duty of care has to have been a proximate cause of the plaintiff's harm or damages. And four, the plaintiff has to have been injured or suffered damages in order to be successful on a claim for negligence. So those are the four elements: that a duty of care was owed, two, that there was a breach of that duty of care by your failure to provide a certain standard of care, and then three, that breach has to have been the cause of the damages or harm, and four, there actually had to have been damages or harm that were suffered by the plaintiff. So let's take it in turn. The first one being the duty of care is a legal obligation to the plaintiff that requires a particular standard of conduct. As I had mentioned in the employee videos, you owe a duty of care to your guests and to your employees. And so that's not new here. I've been saying that in chapters 7 and 8 in discussing legally hiring and selecting and managing your employees. I've been starting to lay the groundwork here for that duty of care that you do owe to your guests and employees. So number one element is met just by virtue of you being the hospitality operator and the plaintiff being your guest or your employee, assuming that they fit the criteria for a guest or an employee, of course, right? So yes, you do owe that duty of care. So that first element's usually pretty easy to meet if it is in fact one of your guests or employees. Some of those specific duties of care that you are that you owe are to provide a reasonably safe premises. So, you hear about slip and falls. In that case, that's a negligence claim, and that is showing that you failed to provide a reasonably safe premises if somebody slipped and fell. Now, obviously, that's not like, okay, slam dunk, case over. I mean, there's obviously circumstances surrounding that, but you do have that duty of care to provide that reasonably safe premises, which is how those slip and fall actions get brought. Proving them up is different, right? You have a duty of care to provide food and beverage that's fit for consumption. I talked about that a little bit in contract law, that the food has to be fit for consumption. But in the negligence world as well, not just contract providing something that's fit for consumption, you have a duty of care under a negligence theory as well to provide food and beverage that's fit for consumption. You have a duty of care to serve alcohol responsibly. We're going to discuss that a little more in detail in Chapter 12's video. You have a duty of care to hire qualified employees. We talked about that in Chapter 7. When you're legally selecting employees, there is that theory of negligent hiring that I mentioned. This is where you're seeing it play out here. You have a duty of care to properly train your employees. You're going to get more of that if you haven't already taken HR. You're going to see more of that in your hospitality human resources class on the importance of properly training your employees. That's also based in a negligence theory as well. Here too, you have that duty of care to your guests and to your other employees to properly train your employees so that they don't hurt somebody. And then you also have a duty of care to terminate employees who pose a danger of harm to your other employees or guests, which we talked about extensively in Chapter 8, where we were talking about disciplinary programs and evaluating your employees. I mentioned the cause of action, negligent retention of employees, and now you're seeing it here too under that first element of negligence of your duty of care. So those are your duties that you have that you do owe to potential plaintiffs who are guests and employees. Obviously, it's not just some general person on the street who's not a guest or an employee. So they have to be one of your guests or an employees to be a plaintiff that would have standing that would say that you owed them a duty of care. So obviously, if they're not a customer and they're not coming in, we'll discuss more of that in Chapter 10 and how to classify whether someone is a guest or a trespasser. But anyway, assuming that they are a guest or an employee, you do owe those duties of care. That is not, the list that I gave is not exhaustive. There are certainly other duties of care that are owed, but those are the really big ones. Now, number two, with the element number two in breaching the duty of care is that you have to fulfill a certain standard of conduct in honoring that duty of care. And that is measured by a standard of care. And the standard of care is an industry recognized or reasonably accepted level of performance. So is there an industry standard for something? Let's say for providing, like I said, you have a duty of care to provide food and beverage that's fit for consumption. Okay, so the duty is to provide food that's fit for consumption. The industry standard, let's say it's a piece of chicken. Industry standard is that you cook a piece of chicken to an internal temperature of 165 degrees. That's the standard of care. So if you cook the chicken to 157 degrees, you have not you've breached your duty of care. Your duty of care was to provide something that was fit for consumption. Industry standard says that no, chicken cooked at 157 degrees is not fit for consumption. Therefore, you've breached your duty of care. Now, let's say you cook the chicken at 165 degrees before serving it. You have cooked it to what is deemed to be fit for consumption by industry standard. So you didn't breach your duty of care. Okay, now to walk through that into causation, which was the third element, if your customer gets sick, which would be their harm, so skip to element 4, damages or harm, that's present, they're sick, okay, they got sick. Now they have to prove that them being sick was because you breached your duty of care. Well, if you cook the chicken to 157 degrees and the industry standard is 165, and the doctor can say they got sick because of salmonella poisoning that came from the chicken, they've met all 4 elements of negligence and you're in trouble. But if you cooked that chicken to 165 degrees and they got sick, but it wasn't necessarily salmonella poisoning, that particular cause of action might not work. So it's possible that they got sick from something else. Now, that's not to say that there couldn't have been something else that you did wrong in the kitchen. So let's say there was some cross contamination, in which case, like, maybe an employee had dirty hands and touched that food and cross contaminated it. Then, and the standard of care is that your employees in the kitchen keep their hands washed and everything clean. Then that would have been a breach of the duty of care in providing something that was fit for consumption, because now you haven't met the industry standard of keeping your hands clean and not cross-contaminating. So that's just a possible scenario to illustrate negligence. Now, there's also something that's called reasonable care, which is the degree that a reasonably prudent person under the same circumstances would act. So a reasonably prudent person under the circumstances would cook chicken to 165 degrees and would say to ensure that you cooked it to 165 degrees, a reasonably prudent person would temp it. They would use a thermometer and temp it. That's what a reasonably prudent person under the circumstances would do. Just looking at the chicken, that would not be what a reasonably prudent person under the circumstances would do. That's not exercising reasonable care just by eyeballing a piece of chicken and saying, oh yeah, that's got to be about 165. It looks dark enough on the outside. We can go ahead and serve it. That's not reasonably prudent. Temping it is. So let's say you tempt it. The thermometer had been calibrated. There was no reason to think that it hadn't been, and the thermometer read 165 degrees, but for some really weird reason, just that time it didn't hit right. It was 157, and you tempt it in the thickest part like you're supposed to. It was all the way in. The method of using the thermometer was all correct. They may have a hard time prevailing on that claim because it did show that you used a reasonable standard of care in trying to meet your obligation. You did temp it. It did say 165 degrees. You temped it properly. The thermometer had been calibrated, but for some reason it was on the fritz, and there's no way you could have known that. That would be acting reasonably prudent. But let's say you didn't do any of that and you sent it out. That's not acting reasonably prudent. So that's a quick discussion on what that means. So another example of using a reasonable amount of care that I want to talk about that's not food related, that's, let's say, more hotel related, would be going back to the reasonably safe premises that has to be provided for your guests and employees. Let's say there's a spill on the floor at the entrance of the lobby of a hotel. Is it reasonably prudent? What would a reasonably prudent hospitality operator do, or hotelier do, or hotel manager, front desk manager, whoever is responsible for that area? What would a reasonably prudent hotel manager do in that circumstance that there's a spill on the floor in the entrance of the lobby? Would it be reasonably prudent to shut down the entire hotel? Is that what a reasonably prudent hotel operator would do? Shut down the entire hotel when there's a little spill by the entrance of the lobby? Probably not. That's a little excessive. So that would not be the expectation in providing a safe environment for your guests. That's extreme. That's not what a reasonably prudent hospitality operator would do. On the other side of that, would a reasonably prudent hospitality operator do nothing and just be like, oh, whatever, it's fine? Because people should see it. They're not going to, if they slip and fall, it's their own fault. Is that reasonably prudent? No. And it's certainly going back to the standard of care of what would be industry standard. That's not industry standard either. So we've got, what would a reasonably prudent hospitality operator do under the circumstances? What would the industry standard be? Is it normal to shut down an entire hotel because of a small spill by the entrance in the lobby? No. Is it normal and industry standard to do nothing? No. So we're somewhere in the middle here. Now we're more in the territory of just blocking off the area itself, like, you know, in a safe area, not like too big, but certainly not too small, need it just right, like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You know, cleaning it up, having proper signage, those types of things. Now we're getting more in the space of what a reasonably prudent hospitality operator would do under the circumstances and what it tends to be industry standards. So that's a quick discussion on your duties of care, negligence explained, and the highlights and things that I wanted to expound on in Chapter 9. There are other components in Chapter 9 that you can take a look at in the slides that give exact definitions of some of the terms that I discussed and explained, and then also describes the anatomy of a lawsuit. I figured you can read through that real quick. I didn't think I needed to walk through the whole process of a lawsuit here. It's more important for me to make sure that you understand the theory of negligence. All right, I'll see you in the next one.